There are still restrictions, these binational restrictions at the border that both Mexico and the United States have agreed to. Um, they have been extended the most recent time until September 21st. If they're not extended again, that'll put us at 6 months since they first went into place. One of the things that's been an issue, though, is that for Mexico, there's been very little enforcement. So for southbound restrictions, there hasn't been much enforcement. And then for northbound crossers, the US can't keep out essentially people who are US citizens or legal permanent residents. So whether or not they have an essential reason, those people are being allowed to cross into the United States. And that's caused a lot of consternation for some leaders. The US ambassador here in Mexico has continually put out statements and tweeted that he's frustrated with how many US citizens are crossing the border, asking them to stop crossing if it's not for a reason that's been deemed essential. Um, and US Customs and Border Protection has actually started slowing traffic basically because they want to, what they've said, make people think twice about crossing and prevent the spread of coronavirus after doing a survey of, they say, 100,000 people and finding that more than 60% of US citizens crossing were not crossing for what's considered an essential reason.
So this is a bit of a double-edged sword because Mexico, Sonora specifically, really relies on tourism. The citizens, as you noted, aren't particularly thrilled, but they need the American dollars. So what's the situation like in places like Rocky Point?
Right. Yes, this is a really interesting situation. Rocky Point is telling people to come. It shut down practically completely at the beginning of the pandemic, basically always with this plan in mind of being able to eventually reopen and reactivate its economy, which depends nearly entirely on tourism and mostly from people who come from Arizona. Tourism officials this week said there have been 50,000 visitors since the beginning of August, bringing about $2 million worth of revenue. And they expect that over Labor Day weekend, they'll have probably another 20,000 people coming to visit. And again, they're welcoming that. 80% of businesses rely on tourism, and they'll already see a huge cut in revenue this year because of the pandemic, but they're trying to recuperate that as much as possible. Like you mentioned, there have been some issues with that. Again, Rocky Point had reopened and was telling people to come down over 4th of July, which was a time they expected to recoup a lot of this lost revenue. But the Sonoran governor had initially put restrictions in place for all ports of entry, saying we're not going to allow US tourists into Sonora right now. Both states were experiencing high rates of infection, but she made an exception for the Lupil-Sonoita crossing, and that caused a lot of issues with people who live in Sonoita, which is, a fairly small but with a significant population, and where people cross to go to Rocky Point. And citizens there protested. They put up blockades. They themselves were turning back tourists over the 4th of July weekend. And then since then have continued protesting and have continued petitioning their government essentially for health resources that they say they need and aren't getting, at the same time that the government's making special exceptions for places like Rocky Point to allow tourists to visit.
Early on in the pandemic, we saw these sanitizing tunnels where the Mexican government was spraying entrance with biozinc. Is that still continuing?
There are still sanitation tunnels in certain places. Some of them are at the border, and these aren't federally implemented. They aren't put in by Mexican customs, for example. They're usually installed by city governments or even by private institutions. And so some of those, as you've mentioned, have been at the border. Rocky Point has some of those. And right now they had been at a checkpoint at the entrance to the city, but they've moved them now to the entrances to beaches. And the idea is, of course, to clean people and to kill the virus, but health experts have really said that that's probably not effective and could even be harmful.
Do you get the sense that this is being handled? I mean, you have nearly 2,500 deaths, or just more than 2,500 deaths in the state of Sonora. What is your reporting telling you? Are people feeling confident that this situation is under control?
Well, In recent days, we've seen some positive indicators. Hospital occupancy has gone down. A couple of weeks ago, for the first time in months, there were daily reported death tolls of single digits. Uh, but there are also issues of high testing positivity rates still. And health officials are saying there may be some positive signs, but this definitely isn't over. People should not let their guard down. We're very much still in the midst of a critical moment in the pandemic here.
Okay, Kendall Bluss joining us from Hermosillo. She is from KJZZ Radio. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Lorraine.